Hi. Another Wednesday. Here we are. Welcome on this beautiful spring day. Today, we're going to continue the series, Curious Tales from the New Testament, on Paul. And this time the topic is Finding Grace in Our Thorns. And again, if you download the PDF file, then you can follow along with the notes. Or at least go back later, look at some of these scripture references. And kind of read them in a little more detail, give you a little time to chew on them a little bit. So today we're reading from 2 Corinthians 12, verses 5 through 10. And it reads, "Of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast except in my infirmities. For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I speak the truth. But I refrain, lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest on me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Now these verses are very familiar to most of us. And he's doing this again in regarding, this is following Paul's vision and his Paul's vision, which we talked about last time. And chapters 10 and 11 in 2 Corinthians talk about Paul once again defending his ministry, and also in dealings with the false apostles who he calls the super apostles. Verse 5, he says, "Of such a one I will boast." This is just referring to the vision that he had, that we talked about last week. "Yet of myself I will not boast except in my infirmities." Paul is essentially saying that this nameless man who had the vision really did have something to boast about. But Paul himself really could only boast in his infirmities, which is exactly what he did in these speaking about these false apostles in 2 Corinthians 11. And I'm going to read verses 22 through 30. Again, I recommend you read both chapters 10 and 11. Here we go. "Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool, I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes, minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, beside the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation? If I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmity." He moves on in verse 6 of 2 Corinthians 12 to say, "Though I might desire to boast, but I won't be a fool." Now he's contrasting himself once again with these super apostles who wouldn't hesitate to boast about the kind of vision that Paul had. In fact, it was joked that they would go on speaking tours about it if they lived today. But Paul's not going to boast in his vision. He wants them to judge him based on his ministry, not on his visions. At the same time, Paul wanted to communicate to them that he really did have such experiences. It's easy to think that the only ones who have profound experiences with God are those who boast about them. Paul never did boast, but he certainly had profound experiences from God. And the proof of those experiences was found in his transformed life and his powerful, truthful ministry. Therefore, Paul felt that it was important to mention this experience, but not to dwell on it. We remember that he doesn't give us much detail. He actually doesn't give us any details about it. He wasn't trying to sell himself to the Christians in Corinth. In fact, he really holds back from his description. He even uses the phrase, and I'm reading from the New King James, but I forbear, meaning he was holding back. Why? Lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. He wanted the Corinthian Christians to see the glory of God expressed in his weakness, not to see him himself as great. Then he moves on in verse 7. This is regarding the thorn in the flesh. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations. Paul's vision was so impressive that it would have been easy for him to be exalted by having experienced it. He was not immune to the danger of pride. No one is. He says, a thorn in the flesh was given to me. Now, Paul here is revealing the real reason for telling of his heavenly vision. Because remember, this follows that vision we talked about. Not to glorify himself, but to explain his thorn in the flesh. Talking about that vision leads into this. So what is a thorn in the flesh? When we think of a thorn, we think of something, a minor irritation. But the root word Paul used for thorn here describes a tent stake, not a thumbtack. In the Septuagint, the word skolops, thorn, shows something which frustrates and causes trouble in the lives of those afflicted. He says that it was a messenger of Satan to buffet me. The thorn was given ultimately by God, but it was a messenger of Satan. You know, we can just imagine Satan jumping at the chance to have God's permission to afflict Paul. But God had a purpose in it all. And yes, a good and perfect God can use the evil that already exists to fulfill his purposes without himself being contaminated or tainted by that evil. Paul feels no need to qualify or explain how God can give his child a redemptive gift of pain through an evil source. This does occur throughout the Bible, and Paul knows his Old Testament. He also knows that the most redemptive gift of pain in history, the suffering and death of Christ, was given to us through the most evil means. Now, the word buffet here means that he felt, in essence, he was beaten black and blue by this messenger of Satan. To buffet is to strike with the fist, to mistreat with violence. We use the word buffet even in describing weather. In a tornado or hurricane, the winds buffeted the house, and we know that it is something that is strong and forceful. So what kind of counsel would Paul receive if he were living today and going through a tough time, one where he felt powerless and out of control, as we often do? Well, he might be told he needed a positive attitude to face that thorn, or that he has the power within to conquer his infirmity. He just needs to look deep inside to find the strength. Or he might be directed to a support group for others that had thorns. And in our culture, Paul would be given medication for depression. A fellow believer might even offer the suggestion that if he had enough faith, he would be delivered from his thorn in the flesh. Now, some of this advice might be good in certain situations, but Paul does what we should all do. He took his problem to the Lord, and he listened because the Lord had something different to say. 2 Corinthians 12:8. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord. Paul did exactly what he told others to do in a time of trouble. Paul believed for himself what he wrote in Philippians 4:6, when he says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." He said, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times. Paul repeatedly prayed to God about this thorn in the flesh. When nothing happened after praying the 3rd time, he knew God was trying to tell him something. Now again, he prayed that it might depart from him. His initial prayer was to escape from the suffering that this thorn in the flesh had brought him. When he suffered, his first instinct, as ours would be to ask God to take it away. And there's nothing wrong with that. I should note that he was in good company. Who else prayed 3 times for something to be removed? Matthew 26, 36 to 46. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." He went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, a second time, he went away and prayed, saying, "O Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away again, and he prayed a third time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hand of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Jesus also prayed 3 times for the cup to be taken from him, before submitting to what lay ahead. So what exactly was Paul's thorn in the flesh? Now, the word for thorn can be used of something in the body or something of the sinful nature. We simply don't have enough information to say precisely, but that hasn't prevented many people from giving their opinion, myself included. Most of the common suggestions seem to be seeing it as some type of spiritual harassment. Others think it was persecution. Some say this was Paul's struggle with lustful and sinful thoughts. Many suggest that it was a physical or mental ailment, though the lack of details in the scriptures forbid a proper diagnosis. Physical infirmities that seem to fit are malaria, something called Malta fever, epilepsy, convulsive attacks, and chronic ophthalmia, which is a severe inflammation of the eye. What do I think? Since you didn't ask, I will tell you anyway. I am personally going with something called Occam's razor, which the only reason I use it is because I love to say Occam. It's just a very cool word. And if you could spell it, I'll be really impressed. But it's a problem-solving principle that essentially states that simple solutions are more likely to be correct than complex ones. When presented with competing hypotheses, basically differing opinions, to solve a problem, you should select the solution with the fewest assumptions. In English, after all is said and done, the simplest explanation is often the correct one. I vote for an eye problem. Why is that? Well, I'm glad you asked. The word for thorn is skolops, as I mentioned earlier, and it's a thorn, a stake, or a sharp piercing object. Here referring to some constant bodily ailment or infirmity of the flesh. Flesh, the word used here, is sarx, signifying the material or substance of the living body, which is to say, it appears that as it is used here, refers to a physical affliction. Now, many of the suggested physical disabilities that it's been guessed that Paul was suffering with also affect the eyesight, and it seems probable that even Paul himself experienced difficulty with his vision, and that this could be the thorn or caused indirectly by this thorn in the flesh. And you're probably wanting evidence. Well, here you go. Paul took advantage of various assistants to do the actual writing of at least some of his epistles. For example, Tertius wrote down the book of Romans and added his own greeting to the Church of Rome, and that's in Romans 16:22. Other times, Paul adds a salutation in his own hands, and we see that in 1 Corinthians 16 and 2 Thessalonians 3:17, as opposed to physically writing the entire epistle himself. In Galatians 6:11, he even wrote in large print, as he noted. other evidences of poor vision can be found earlier in the epistle to the Galatians. Now, Paul says that because of physical infirmity, he preached to the Galatians first. That's from Galatians 4. Only 2 verses later, he states that the Galatian church would have plucked out their own eyes and given them to him if it were possible. Again, indicating a possible eye issue. Another possible example of Paul's poor eyesight is found in Acts 23, 3 through 5. And this one always caught my attention because I couldn't make sense of it. In this context, it actually makes sense. Paul was in front of the Sanhedrin at this point, and he was referred to the high priest as a whitewashed wall. And those who stood by him asked why he was insulting the high priest. Paul responded by telling them that he did not realize the man was the high priest. Paul, who had previously been a Pharisee, would have recognized the high priest. Yet at this point he seemed unable to do so, even though the priest would have stood out, even if only because of the special garments he would wear. For a former Pharisee to have not recognized him is likely explained by Paul not seeing him properly, giving weight to the theories of trouble with his vision. And to be clear again, we are not told it's vision problems, that was his thorn in the flesh, but to me there's a lot of evidence indicating that as adverse to some other problems. So each of the suggestions I've mentioned can be possible, but God may have had a definite purpose in not revealing the exact nature of Paul's thorn. So why wouldn't he tell us? Perhaps because if we knew exactly what Paul's thorn was, then everybody who was not afflicted in the same way might not be able to see that Paul's experience was relevant for them. And we're all about things being relevant for us these days. But everyone with any kind of thorn in the flesh should be able to put themselves in Paul's shoes. In 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10, this talks about God's provision to Paul through his thorn in the flesh. Verse 9, and he said to me, this is God responding to Paul. The answer was not what Paul initially had hoped for or expected, because remember, he asked for healing. But God still had a response for him. And don't make the mistake of doing what sometimes we do. We close our ears to God if he responds in a way we didn't hope for or we didn't expect. He said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Now notice here, instead of removing the thorn, God gave his grace to Paul, and the grace was sufficient to meet his every need. Paul was desperate in his desire to find relief from this burden, but there are 2 ways of relief. It can come by removing the load or by strengthening the shoulder that bears the load. Instead of taking away the thorn, God strengthened Paul under it, and God would continue to show his strength through Paul's apparent weakness. Paul had to believe that God's grace is sufficient. So, what is grace? One definition I liked is it's the love and mercy given to us by God because God desires us to have it, not necessarily because of anything we have done to deserve it. In his grace, God is willing to forgive us and bless us abundantly, in spite of the fact that we don't deserve to be treated so well or dealt with quite so generously. Grace is actively and continually working in the lives of God's people. Paul credited the success of his ministry not to his substantial labors, but to the grace of God that was with me. And that's 1 Corinthians 15. Grace is the ongoing, benevolent act of God working in us, without which we can do nothing, John 15:5. God is greater than our sin, Romans 5:20. It's more abundant than we expect, 1 Timothy 1:14, and it is too wonderful for words, 2 Corinthians 9:15. But we don't really believe God's grace is sufficient until we believe and come to understand that we are insufficient. This can be a huge obstacle. We admire the self-made man. We rely on self-reliance. We love people that pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and get the job done. But we can't receive God's strength until we know our own weakness. We can't receive the sufficiency of his grace until we know our own insufficiency. Grace could meet Paul's need, because it expresses God's acceptance of and his pleasure in us. He is favorably disposed toward us. We have his favor and approval and his promise of care. Grace could meet Paul's need because it was available all the time. When we sin or we fail, it doesn't put us outside the reach of God's grace. It is ever ready to meet us and to minister to our need. Grace could meet Paul's need because it was the very strength of God. God loves to show his power through his goodness and his grace. It is the power of God to supply or to fulfill that which we lack. David Guzik writes, "The man who traveled the ancient world, spreading the gospel of Jesus despite the fiercest persecutions, who endured shipwrecks and imprisonment, who preached to kings and slaves, who established strong churches and trained up their leaders, was not a weak man. In light of his life and accomplishments, we would say that Paul was a very strong man. But he was only strong because he knew his weakness, and he looked outside himself for the strength of God's grace. If we want lives of such strength," he continues, "we must also understand and admit our weakness and look to God alone for the grace that will strengthen us for any task. It was the grace-filled Paul who said, 'I can do all things through him who strengthens me,' Philippians 4:13. His grace is sufficient now, not someday, but now. God's word stands. My grace is sufficient for you." Now let's look and see how God's grace made the difference and how it met Paul's need at this point. Verse 10, "Therefore I most gladly will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Paul's continued dependence upon God made him stronger than he would have ever been if his revelations made him proud or self-sufficient. God deliberately engineered these circumstances into Paul's life so he would be in constant, total dependence on God's grace and strength. Many of us long for the day when our Christian life will be easy, when the major struggles with sin are behind us and we go on to bigger and better things without much of a struggle anymore. That day's an illusion. We do grow in maturity. We do learn to avoid some problems that maybe when we're newer in the faith we would have. There is growth, there is strength, there is maturity. But to have that day gone completely, that's the illusion, at least in this life. If Paul himself constantly experienced weaknesses, who are we to think that we would expect otherwise? In fact, it's the illusion of strength and independence that actually leave us in a weaker place. Morgan says that there is nothing more hindering to the work of God than the uplifted and proud Christian. McLaren observes that one should banish all thoughts of their own cleverness, intellectual ability, culture, sufficiency for their work, and learn that only when they are emptied can they be filled. And only when they know themselves to be nothing are they ready for God to work through them. Therefore, Paul says, "I take pleasure in my infirmities." To be pleased with is what that means, to think good of. That's kind of an odd thought for us, because most of the time, I know, at least for me, it's like I can grit my teeth and get through it if I have to. This is different. He takes pleasure in them. In the final analysis, Paul didn't seek his thorn. It came to him. But he didn't simply resign himself to his fate. He embraced it. He rejoiced that God has forced him to rely on his grace and strength. Now, most of us provide our own thorns, and an honest look shows enough weakness to make us need to rely constantly and totally on the grace and strength of Christ. And Paul goes on to say, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." God allowed this thorn to show his divine strength in Paul. If we want lives of strength, we must also understand and admit our weakness and look to God alone for that grace that will strengthen us for any task. Again, it was the grace-filled Paul who said, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." That's from Philippians 4. Have you experienced a thorn in your flesh? I know you have. Did you try and get out of it? How did you try to get out of it? Well, my conclusion is that your thorn is going to be different from mine, though we do share some thorns in common. But its purpose will be similar. We are given thorns that weaken us in order to make us stronger. We all can identify with Paul in this. What Paul's thorn wasn't the point. The point is, what was God's purpose for the thorn? Pride in all its forms is our most pervasive sin, and arguably the most dangerous to us spiritually. Anything God gives us to keep us humble and prayerfully dependent on Him is a great gift, even when that gift causes us pain. That's how Paul saw it. And here we see that God disciplines His children with affliction in order to protect them from being destroyed by the sin of pride. Redemptive pain can protect us from destructive pain. You take that and think about that one for a little while. Redemptive pain can protect us from destructive pain. And in the movie The Princess Bride, the Dread Pirate Roberts said, "Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something." There's a lot of truth in that. Life is pain. And anyone who tells you differently is trying to sell you something. This is the reason we have our thorns. Without them, we could miss experiencing the glory of God's grace and the joy that comes as a result. It's a kingdom paradox. Our painful thorns end up producing greater joy in us and ultimately make us more effective and fruitful. The more we press on in this paradox, the more we will say with Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10. I'm going to end with this verse. "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." So thank you for joining me today. Next week we will continue to look at some experiences in the life of Paul, getting close to wrapping up this series. Thank you for joining me every week, and hopefully we'll see you next week.